My name is Ande Rhodes.
My name is Monica Brown.
My name is David.
And this project is the biodiversity of flower species, proportion of native versus non-native species in Hampton University, and possible impacts. For the abstract in this project, we examined the biodiversity of native flora on Hampton University's campus. The data includes the number of non-native and native species on the campus. The data was collected and counted from a database called iNaturalist. And then further research was conducted on their ecological roles and impacts in the environment using iNaturalist and Plants Database of the United States Department of Agriculture. For the introduction, in order to define the terms used in this research, we did external research and found for this project, native species is that which naturally occurs in an environment. A non-native species is that which is intentionally or unintentionally introduced by humans. And an invasive species is that which is a harmful non-native species, measuring harmfulness to the surrounding native species. This research gave us the basis for how we went about researching and identifying the roles and impacts of the floral species identified. So what we found was that a native species has many benefits such as help maintain soil and prevent or reduce erosion. A decline in native species was also found to decrease native pollinators such as bees and butterflies. So overall, the research showed us that a decline in native species could negatively impact an environment. And so on the Hampton University's campus, this is particularly important because there's frequent construction and remodeling, often followed by rain, especially during wet seasons such as this time. So these conditions make the soil susceptible to erosion. What we were thinking was that if an environment such as the soil is vulnerable without native species, in addition to the amount of how many new plants the campus gets for aesthetics, it seemed important to explore the proportion and impacts as it relates to native versus non-native species.
For methodology, the data was gathered with the use of the application iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a database that aids in identification of plant and animal species. The data on iNaturalist is input by local observers in the specified area. To ensure that the inputted data is identified properly, professors and other observers give feedback and recommendations. The area of study on iNaturalist was the Hampton University campus. From the database, the quantities of native and non-native flora were found. Once they were found, they were organized to find the percentages present on the campus. Finding the percentages allowed for non-native plants to be split into two categories: invasive species and non-invasive species. The invasive and non-invasive plants were then put in a ratio to analyze their effects on the environment.
For results, the data from this experiment shows that there were more native than non-native species on Hampton University's campus. Given that 51% of the population was native as opposed to non-native species, which made up 49%. Each of the non-native species on Hampton University's campus were identified as invasive or non-invasive. Of the 49% of non-invasive species on the campus, 32% were invasive species. However, the majority of invasive species provided goods and services. The most common goods and services provided were provisional, as nearly 55% of the invasive population were used as food for organisms in the ecosystem. For example, the Cornus florida, more commonly known as the flowering dogwood or the American boxwood, produces a yellow and red berry-like drupe, which contains the tree's seeds. These fruiting bodies attract many types of birds, from small songbirds to larger game birds. Additionally, the fruits attract squirrels, chipmunks, and rabbits. Each of these organisms use the flowering dogwood fruit as a source of nutrition and food. Like the dogwood, many of the invasive species on Hampton University's campus provide a similar source of food to the ecosystem. Additionally, 30% of the invasive species provided cultural goods and services in the form of landscaping. For example, fountain grasses are a well-known and commonly used invasive species that provides ornamental landscaping appeal. The bright green stems grow up to 4 feet tall. This invasive species can be seen all across Hampton University's campus.
Discussion. When discussed, we had come to the conclusion that despite the negative connotation associated with invasive species, majority of them provided goods and services that were advantageous to the habitat. There were only a small portion of invasive species that produce an unfavorable effect on the environment. In the end, our initial hypothesis was rejected due to the fact that there were more native species in comparison to non-native species. The group had previously assumed that the majority of non-native species produced negative consequences. However, this was also rejected on the basis of our findings that most of the non-native species provided regulatory, provisional, cultural, and supportive goods and services. With this information, Hampton University can maintain a healthy habitat full of biodiversity if the university researches the possible effects of plants that may be introduced to the campus and ensure that any new species that are introduced have benefits that outweigh their risks. Other plants that are introduced by the university must also interact well with the existing species on campus. By doing this, Hampton University can remain a successful habitat that contains an abundance of biodiversity.